Okay, this is the video for Unit 1, Lesson 4. We're in Chapter 4, Section 4 of the textbook, and this lesson is about complex numbers. Our content standards for this lesson are first, that you will know that there is a complex number I, and that I is defined in such a way that I squared is -1, and every complex number has the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers. And the second content standard is that you're going to use the relation I squared equals -1 and the different properties of math, the commutative property, associative, and distributive properties, to add and subtract and multiply complex numbers. Our mathematical practice for this lesson is that we're going to focus on attending to precision. We've got to make sure our answers are precise, they're exact, and that we don't make any mistakes. So in the past, you should have learned how to simplify square roots. If you don't know how to do that, pause the video and ask me, and I'll quickly cover that with you guys in class. What we're going to do in this lesson is perform operations with pure imaginary numbers, and we're going to perform operations with complex numbers. Here's a new vocabulary for the lesson. Okay, so our first example is about square roots of negative numbers, and we need to simplify the square root of -28. So what we're going to do first is we're going to break down -28 into all of its factors. And the key here is you want to try to look and see if there's any factors of -28 that happen to be perfect squares. So the first thing you're always going to do is you're going to factor out the -1. So if you take -1 out of -28, you're just left with the number 28. And you should know that 28 is 4 times 7. So we wrote 4 here as 2 squared times 7. Then what you're going to do, you're going to take each of these factors, break it up, give it its own square root. The square root of -1 is defined as I, so it always becomes I. Don't worry about it. Don't let it freak you out. It just is the number I. The square root of 2 squared, or the square root of 4, if you want to think about it that way, is the number 2. And the square root of 7 you can't simplify. So you just take this stuff and rearrange it as 2i times the square root of 7. Anytime you have an answer that includes I in it, you want to make sure that you put the I and any regular old numbers in front of a square root. If you happen to accidentally leave, like for example, the 2 or the I in this problem after the square root, sometimes if you're not careful about how far the square root sign goes, it can look like the 2 or the I is still underneath this square root. Leave the 2 or the I underneath the square root, then the problem is technically wrong. So just make sure anytime you have a problem like this, that all the whole numbers, like the 2 or the I or anything that's not inside of a square root, you need to write them in front of the square root sign. Okay, our second example of part B was we're going to simplify the square root of -32. Remember, the first thing you're going to want to do is take out the -1, and then if you break down 32 into its factors, 32 is 2 times 16. So here we write 16 as 4 squared. Then you're going to break up each one of these, give it its own square root sign. Square root of -1 again is I. The square root of 16, or 4 squared, that's just 4. And then square root of 2, can't simplify that. So this is just 4i times the square root of 2. Okay, here's an example for you guys to work on your own. Pause the video as long as you need. You need to find the square root of -50. When you have your answer, come back to the video and advance to the next slide. All right, so our answer here is C, 5i times the square root of 2. Here's another one for you to check your progress on. You need to simplify the square root of -45. Pause the video again, and when you have your answer, come back and advance to the next slide. And our answer here is 3i times the square root of 5, choice A. Okay, for example 2, what we're going to be doing is looking at products of pure imaginary numbers. So basically what that means is that you have an imaginary number times another imaginary number, and there's no real numbers mixed in with the problem at all. So here we have this negative 3i times 2i. What you're going to do first with this problem is multiply the i's together. I times I is I squared, and negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. And from the content standard at the beginning of the presentation, hopefully you remember that I squared is equal to negative 1. It's written right over here. So you can just replace I squared with negative 1. And then negative 6 times negative 1 is positive 6. So the simplification of negative 3i times 2i, the answer is just 6. Okay, part B, we're going to simplify the square root of negative 12 times the square root of negative 2. So just like we looked at in the first example, we want to take the square root of negative 12, and we're going to take out the square root of negative 1. We're going to take the negative 1 out, and that becomes the letter I. So this is I times the square root of 12. We're not going to simplify this yet. The square root of negative 2 is just the square root of negative 1 times the square root of positive 2. So we take out the square root of negative 1 and rewrite that as I. Then we have the two i's. I times I is I squared, which remember is negative 1. And square root of 12 times square root of 2 is square root of 24. And we're going to break down 24 into its factors, trying again to find a factor that is a perfect square. 4 here is a perfect square. It's 2 times 2. So that's why we chose 4 times 6. The square root of 4 is 2. So we have negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. And then the root 6, we can't simplify that anymore, so our answer is just negative 2 times the square root of 6. Okay, here's one for you to check your progress on. You need to simplify 3i times 5i. Pause the video as long as you need, and then when you have your answer, come back and advance to the next slide. So our answer here is B, negative 15. Here's another one for you to check your progress on. You need to simplify the square root of negative 2 times the square root of negative 6. When you're ready, when you have your answer, go on to the next slide. And our answer here again is B, negative 2 times the square root of 3. Okay, for example 3, we're going to be looking at an equation that has purely imaginary solutions. So we need to solve an equation, and when we solve it, we're basically going to get a square root that has a negative number inside the square root. So the first thing we're going to do here is we are going to bring the 20 to the other side. Then we're going to divide by 5, so we end up with y squared is negative 4. Then you're going to square root each side, so you have plus or minus. Whenever you take the square root of a number, you always say plus or minus in front of your answer. Then you're going to have the square root, because you took the square root of each side, square root of negative 4. Remember that negative 4, the square root, is square root of positive 4 times the square root of negative 1. Bring out that negative 1. That's the letter I. And the square root of 4 is 2. So we have 2i. And the plus or minus sign comes down. So we have plus or minus 2i. Our first answer is positive 2i, and our second answer is negative 2i. Okay, for you guys to check your progress, go ahead and try to solve 2x squared plus 50 equals 0. Pause the video. When you have your answer, come back and advance to the next slide. And our answer here is plus or minus 5i. Okay, complex numbers. Here's a key concept. A complex number is any number that can be written in the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers, and I is the imaginary unit. Remember, I is just the square root of negative 1. A is called the real part of the complex number, and b is called the imaginary part of the complex number. So for example, we have 5 plus 2i, that's a complex number. the real part is 5 and the imaginary part is 2i. Or if we had 1 minus 3i, our imaginary part is the negative 3i, that's the b, and our real part is a. So in example 4, we're going to look at how to equate complex numbers. And we need to find the values of x and y that make the equation 2x plus yi equals negative 14 minus 3i true. The nice thing about this is it might seem kind of difficult, but it's really just basic Algebra 1 that you're going to be looking at. You're going to set the real parts equal to each other. Here we have the real part is 2x. Remember, the real part is the part that doesn't have the I in it. So here the real part is 2x, here the real part is negative 14. So you say 2x is negative 14. Just basic Algebra 1. You're going to solve that and get x is negative 7. For the imaginary parts, you have yi equals negative 3i, and hopefully you can see then that y is just going to be negative 3. And that's how we solve the problem. Okay, here's one for you to check your progress on. Find the values of x and y that make the equation 3x minus yi equals 15 plus 2i true. Pause the video as long as you need. When you have your answer, come on back and advance to the next slide. The answer here is D. X is 5 and y is negative 2. Okay, for example 5, we're going to add and subtract complex numbers. In part A, we have 3 plus 5i plus 2 minus 4i. And here, basically what we're going to want to do is, again, we're going to combine the real parts and we're going to combine the imaginary parts. So our real parts here are 3 plus 2, and obviously 3 plus 2 is 5. And our imaginary parts are 5i and negative 4i. So 5i minus 4i is 1i. There we go. 5 plus I, that's our final answer. Okay, part B, we're going to simplify 4 minus 6i minus 3 minus 7i. So again, what we're going to look at first is our real parts. We have 4 minus 3. 4 minus 3 is obviously 1. For our imaginary parts, we have negative 6i minus negative 7i. And remember, if we have minus a negative, that's 2 minus signs in a row, so it becomes plus. So it's really saying negative 6i plus 7i. Negative 6 plus 7 is 1. So 1i, 1 plus 1i, or just 1 plus I is our final answer. Here's one for you guys to check your progress on. You need to simplify 2 plus 6i plus 3 plus 4i. Pause the video as long as you need. Come back when you are ready to check the answer. And our answer here is D, 5 plus 10i. One more problem for you to check on, 3 plus 2i minus negative 2 plus 5i. When you're ready, go on to the next slide. And this time the answer is B, 5 minus 3i. All right, we're going to pause here and pick up with example 6 in the next video.